The diesel engines woke Roy Calloway before the sun did. It was a little after 6 on a cold March morning in 2024, and the old man was already out on his porch in the Tennessee foothills, both hands wrapped around a tin cup of black coffee just to keep them from shaking. Frost sat white on the pasture fence. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet cedar. Down the mountain, far below the tree line, came a sound he had been dreading for 2 years. Engines. A lot of them. Climbing the gravel switchbacks toward his farm. Roy set the cup on the railing and squinted into the gray light. A line of trucks crawled up the mountain road, headlights stacked one behind another, more than he could count from where he stood. His chest went tight. He had stopped opening the letters from the bank months ago. He knew what this was. They had come for the land his grandfather cleared by hand. He was 83 years old, and he thought he was watching the end of everything his family had built. What none of those drivers knew, and what Roy himself had half forgotten, was that 34 years earlier, this same man had given away the single most valuable thing he owned. He had given it to a half-starved girl that the whole county said wasn't worth the trouble. Before I tell you who is behind the wheel of the first truck, do me a favor and let me know in the comments where you're watching from this morning. I read every one of them. Now let me take you back to the summer it started. His name was Roy Calloway, and in the spring of 1990, he was a 49-year-old horseman with more pride than money. The Calloway place sat on 300 acres in the hills outside Townsend, a green fold of land where the Smoky Mountains start to soften into farm country. His grandfather had cleared the first pasture with a mule and an axe. His father had built the long stock barn that still stood behind the house. Roy had spent his whole life on that ground, breeding and training Tennessee walking horses, and folks for 3 counties around knew that a horse with the Calloway brand on it had been raised right. He was a big man, slow to talk and quick to work, with forearms like fence posts, and a sunburned neck that never quite faded even in winter. He wore the same brown felt hat until it fell apart, and then he bought one exactly like it. People trusted him. They didn't always understand him. His wife, Maggie, understood him better than anyone. She was 46 that spring, small and sharp-eyed, with a laugh that carried clear across the yard. She kept the books, ran the kitchen, and worried about Roy the way he worried about the horses. Money was thin that year. Hay had run short over a hard winter. 2 foals had been born sickly, and the price of feed kept climbing while the price of a good horse did not. Roy didn't say much about it. Maggie could read the whole ledger in the set of his shoulders at the supper table. But Roy Calloway had one thing of real value, and its name was Banner. Banner was a black walking horse stallion, 16 hands of muscle and shine, out of a bloodline that went back 3 generations on the Calloway farm. He had taken ribbons at every show in the region. Breeders drove up from 2 states away just to look at him. A stallion like that was not livestock. He was the future of the whole operation, the one asset that could pull the farm back from the edge if the worst came. Everyone knew Banner was the most valuable thing on the mountain. Keep that in mind. It matters more than you'd think. She came walking up the road on the last hot afternoon of July, and Roy almost didn't see her. He was bent under the hood of the old flatbed, swearing at a corroded battery cable when a shadow fell across the engine. He straightened up. A girl stood at the edge of the gravel, maybe 17, thin as a rail, with sun-cracked lips and a canvas duffel hanging off one shoulder by a knotted strap. Her boots had split along the sole. She had the careful, braced look of someone used to being told to move along. "You hiring?" she asked. Her voice was dry as paper. Roy wiped his hands on a rag and took his time looking at her. "Where'd you come from?" "Down the county road. Before that, doesn't matter." She shifted the duffel. "I'll work for food. I don't need pay." The story came out slow over the next few minutes, the way these stories do. Her name was Nora Vance. She had spent most of her life in foster homes. the kind that take you for the check and forget your birthday, and she'd aged out of the last one with nothing but the bag on her shoulder and $12 folded in her sock. She'd been walking for 9 days. She didn't ask for pity and didn't seem to expect any. Roy knew the smart answer was no. He couldn't feed his own horses without doing arithmetic in his head. He surely couldn't take on a stranger. "You eaten today?" he asked instead. Nora hesitated half a second too long before she answered, and that pause told him everything. "Come on up to the house," Roy said. "Maggie's got supper near ready." That night, Nora ate 3 plates at the Calloway table while Maggie kept filling them and pretending not to notice. Roy watched the girl the way he watched a young horse, looking for what was underneath. And he noticed something. Whenever the talk turned to the animals, to the sick foal in the back stall or the mare with the bad hoof, Nora leaned in. Not polite interest, real hunger to know. She started the next morning before he was even up. By the end of the week, she was the first one in the barn and the last one out. She didn't love the farm work, the hauling and the fence mending. She loved the horses. She'd sit for an hour with the ailing foal, reading its breathing, and twice she caught something going wrong before Roy did. One evening he watched her wrap a swollen fetlock with a patience most grown hands never learn, and he understood what he was looking at. The girl had a doctor's hands. All she'd ever lacked was somebody to bet on her. By the end of August, Roy had made up his mind to do a thing that would cost him more than he could afford, and down in his gut, he already knew there was only one way to pay for it. The morning Roy sold Banner, half the men in the county decided he'd gone soft in the head. A breeder from over near Knoxville came with a trailer and a cashier's check, and Roy stood in the lot with his hands in his pockets while they loaded his stallion. Maggie watched from the porch and didn't say a word. Banner went up the ramp clean, the way Roy had trained him, and the trailer pulled out of the yard and down the mountain and was gone. The money wasn't for the farm. It wasn't for the feed bill or the back taxes. Roy used every dollar of it to enroll Nora Vance in a 2-year veterinary technician program 3 hours away, and to put a roof over her head while she studied. Word got around fast. At the feed store they shook their heads. "A man drowning in debt," they said, "and he goes and sells the one horse that could have saved him, all for a runaway nobody who'll be gone by Christmas." Roy let them talk. He drove Nora to the bus station himself, handed her an envelope with her first month's rent in it, and stood on the platform until the bus was out of sight. "You don't owe me a thing," he told her before she climbed aboard. "Just don't waste it." He wasn't afraid that day. He'd been afraid plenty about the money. But watching that bus pull away, what he mostly felt was something closer to hope. The first year nearly broke her. Nora rented a narrow room above a boarding house run by a widow named Della Hartman, a stooped woman in her 70s who charged her almost nothing and had a habit of cooking far too much stew and leaving a covered bowl outside Nora's door, always pretending she'd made too much by accident. By day, Nora studied anatomy and pharmacology and lab work. By night, she swept floors and cleaned cages at a country clinic run by a gruff old vet named Gus Hadley, who barely spoke to her for the first 2 months and then quietly started teaching her everything he knew. Money ran out anyway. By winter, she was living on day-old bread and instant coffee, skipping meals to cover the cost of a textbook. One freezing night, after a failed exam and another bill she couldn't pay, she sat on the floor of that little room and seriously thought about quitting. She could go back to waiting tables. At least she'd eat. 3 days later, an envelope showed up with a Tennessee postmark. Inside was a $20 bill and a scrap torn off the back of a feed store receipt. On it, in Roy's blocky handwriting, were 6 words: "Green horses become great ones. Don't stop." Nora knew exactly what that $20 cost a man like Roy Calloway. She read the note until the creases went soft. That night, she made herself a promise, and she folded the scrap of paper into the back of her wallet, where it would stay for the next 3 decades. If you want to know what that note carried her through, make sure you've hit subscribe, because what happened to Nora next almost ended everything before it started. In her final year, a colicky stallion she was treating reared in the stalks and came down on her right hand. 3 bones broke. The surgeon, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Okafor, sat her down and told her plainly that a hand like that might never be steady enough for surgery again. For a vet who wanted to operate on large animals, it was the worst news there was. Nora taped Roy's note to the rail of her hospital bed. She did her rehab the way she'd done everything else since the day she walked up that mountain road, stubbornly and without complaint. Slowly, the strength came back into her fingers. She graduated that spring near the top of her class, the only one in the room with no family in the seats. Over the years that followed, Nora Vance built something. She started with a single second-hand truck fitted out as a mobile clinic, driving from farm to farm across the Southeast, treating horses and cattle for families who couldn't haul their animals to a city vet. People trusted her the way they'd once trusted Roy. The one truck became a fleet. By 2024, her company ran mobile veterinary units across 5 states, and the note from a Tennessee horseman still lived in the back of her wallet. While Nora's name was spreading across the South, Roy Calloway's world was quietly falling apart. Maggie had passed in 2016, gone in her sleep after 40 years of marriage, and the house had been too quiet ever since. Roy kept working the farm alone, but the math had turned against him. Feed prices doubled. A drought killed 2 seasons of hay. He took out a loan to cover a vet bill and a barn repair, then another to cover the first, and the debt grew into something he couldn't see the bottom of. By early 2024, he owed the bank just over $200,000, and the foreclosure papers were already moving. He stopped opening the letters. They sat in a shoebox in the bottom drawer of the kitchen desk. At 83, with his hands stiff every morning from arthritis, Roy still walked his pastures every day. He couldn't picture being anywhere else. He just couldn't see how to stay. 2 states away, Nora's company was running a free clinic day for struggling ranchers when an old farrier named Buck Lanier mentioned a name she hadn't heard out loud in years. "You ever work up around Townsend?" Buck said, filing down a hoof. "Old boy named Calloway up that way. Horseman. Real shame what's happening to his place. Bank's about to take it. Been there 100 years too." Nora set down her instruments. That night she sat alone in her office long after everyone had gone home. She took the worn scrap of paper out of her wallet and read it one more time. "Green horses become great ones. Don't stop." Then she picked up the phone. She didn't call Roy. She called her financial team and asked them, quietly, to find out exactly how much trouble the Calloway farm was in. 2 days later, the report landed on her desk. She read it twice. Every number was worse than she'd feared. The mortgage, the back loans, the equipment debt, the foreclosure date. The man who had sold his future to buy her one was about to lose everything he had left. Nora closed the file and looked out the window for a long while. Then she started making calls of a different kind. Over the next 3 weeks, she worked in secret. She had an attorney named Frances Aldridge, a woman who had spent her career fighting to keep mountain families on their land, quietly buy up the full balance of the Calloway debt. She arranged for every mobile unit her company could spare to drive to Tennessee. She booked vets, farriers, and equipment crews. And she did one more thing, the thing that took the longest. She tracked down a young, black stallion 3 states away. A horse 3 generations removed from a champion named Banner, and she bought him back into the bloodline Roy had sold to save her. She told Roy none of it. She wanted to see his face. Which brings us back to that cold March morning and the engines climbing the mountain. Roy stood on his porch and counted the trucks as they came through the gate, and he lost count somewhere past 24. Mobile clinics, stock trailers, a flatbed loaded with lumber, pickups pulling toolboxes. By the time the convoy filled his yard, the neighbors were already gathering along the fence line, drawn by a noise no one on that road had ever heard. Word travels fast in hill country. Some of them had come to watch the old man lose his farm. Sheriff Tom Pruitt pulled up in his cruiser, a heavy-set man in his 60s who'd grown up 2 ridges over and had watched too many family farms go under. He got out scratching his head. "Roy," he called, "I got no idea what this is. I never seen a foreclosure roll in with vet trucks. 30-some vehicles, more than 40 people on the property, and not one of them said a word about the bank." Roy gripped the porch rail. Crews were already unloading. A man knelt to check a lame mare in the corral. 2 others started measuring the sagging barn roof his father had built. Then a mud-spattered pickup eased up near the barn, and the driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was somewhere around 50, lean and weathered, with gray coming in at her temples and the steady stance of someone who'd spent her life on her feet around animals. She looked across the yard, past the crowd, straight at the old man on the porch. Then she smiled, and it was a smile Roy hadn't seen in 34 years. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "it's Nora." The coffee cup slipped out of his hand and broke on the porch boards. For a few seconds, Roy couldn't move. His mind would not connect this calm, capable woman with the starving girl in split boots who'd asked him for food on a July afternoon. Then it all came back at once. The supper table, the sick foal, the bus station, Banner going up the ramp. He came down the steps faster than a man his age should, and the 2 of them met in the middle of the yard and held on. 40-some people stood watching in the cold, and more than a few of them wiped their eyes. Sheriff Pruitt turned around and studied the tree line for a moment longer than he needed to. When they finally stepped apart, Nora reached into her truck and brought out a wooden frame. Behind the glass was a photograph from the summer of 1990, the 2 of them standing beside Banner in the barn doorway, Roy's arm across her thin shoulders. Tucked into the corner of the frame was a faded $20 bill and a scrap of feed store paper gone yellow with age. The handwriting had nearly worn away, but you could still read it. "Green horses become great ones. Don't stop." I carried that in my wallet for 34 years. Nora said quietly. "Every time the money ran out, every time I broke something, every time I wanted to walk away, I read those 6 words." She looked around the yard at her crews already at work. "You didn't just sell a horse, Roy. You bought me a whole life." But she wasn't finished. The next morning she took him into town. They drove down the mountain to a brick office on the square where Francis Aldridge had a stack of documents waiting on a long table. Roy put on his reading glasses, his hands trembling a little, and worked through the pages. The first few he didn't understand. Then he reached the last one and stopped breathing. Paid in full. Every loan. The mortgage. The back taxes. The equipment debt. The foreclosure terminated. For the first time since the year his father died, the Calloway farm belonged to a Calloway, free and clear of any bank in the world. Roy lowered the papers and looked at Nora. "Why?" was the only word he could find. She didn't answer with words. She drove him back up the mountain and led him not to the house, but down to the far pasture, where one of her crews stood waiting by a stock trailer. They dropped the ramp. A young black stallion backed out into the sunlight, 16 hands of muscle and shine, with a white blaze and a way of carrying his head that Roy would have known anywhere. "He's 3 generations down from Banner," Nora said. "Took my people 2 months to find him. The bloodline never left these mountains, Roy. It just took a while to come home." The old man walked up to the stallion on stiff legs and laid his palm flat against the warm neck, and for the second time in 2 days, he didn't bother to hide that he was crying. Then Nora pointed back toward the old stock barn, the one her crews had spent the week rebuilding. A new sign hung above the wide doors, freshly painted. The Roy Calloway Program. She explained it standing right there in the pasture. The barn would become a working clinic. Every year, it would take in kids aging out of foster care, the ones with nowhere to land, and teach them the veterinary and equine trades, room and board and tuition covered. It would run free, large animal care for families in the hills who couldn't afford a vet. The first class would be 10 students. Why my name? Roy asked. Nora looked at the barn where she'd once mucked stalls as a hungry 17-year-old, then back at the man who'd taken a chance on her. Because there's no me without you, she said. Everything I built started the day you decided I was worth a horse. 1 year later, 10 young people stood in the rebuilt barn on the first graduation day of the Roy Calloway program. Some of them had been homeless. Some had bounced through the same kind of foster homes Nora knew by heart. All of them had spent a year learning to read a horse's breathing and steady a calf and set a broken bone. Roy, 84 now and a little slower on his feet, stood in front of them as the guest of honor. His voice wasn't strong, but the barn was dead quiet, so it carried fine. He told them the truth as he'd come to understand it, that the most valuable thing he ever owned was never the stallion. It was the chance he took on a girl everybody else had written off. He'd thought he was giving something away. It turned out he was planting something. Out in the far pasture, Banner's grandson grazed in the late afternoon light, and the bloodline went on. Here's the part that stays with me. Roy got to see how far his kindness traveled. Most people never do. You hold a door, you feed a stranger, you tell somebody not to quit, and then your life moves on, and you forget you ever did it. You almost never learn what it grew into. Roy spent 34 years thinking he'd thrown away his best horse for nothing. He had no idea he'd been raising a forest the whole time. So, let me ask you something, and I mean it. Has there ever been a person who believed in you when nobody else would? A teacher, a stranger, somebody who handed you $20 and 6 words at exactly the moment you were ready to give up. Tell me about them in the comments. Say their name. I think they'd want to know it mattered. And if stories like this one are the kind you want more of, subscribe and stay with us. There's another one coming, and it's a good one. Take care of each other out there. We'll see you next time.